The following video contains spoilers for Final Fantasy XVI and Echoes of the Fallen. When it comes to a $10 DLC, the adage that you get what you pay for isn't always true. In a gaming landscape where skins, characters, and battle passes can add up to $10 or even more, it's hard to gauge exactly what $10 is going to get you. Taking that out of the online multiplayer space and into a single player story based space, and the line blurs even more. Echoes of the Fallen seeks to give a condensed but rewarding experience, an experience they hope will be enough to pad the season pass and tide the player base over until the much more extensive and expensive Leviathan themed DLC The Rising Tide drops later this year. If you are a fan of the base game, this is essentially an endgame dungeon for you to fight through, testing all of your skills while giving you one final romp with Jill, Torgal, and Joshua before returning to Origin for the game's finale. And as a fan of the base game, I felt that the DLC did its job adequately, while playing things almost annoyingly safe, offering a Buster Sword, 3 hours of content, and a 5 level cap increase. The value of the DLC was going to be based solely off of the content itself, and more importantly with a game like this, the bosses. Delving into the Fallen Ruins is something we had done plenty of times before in the base game, and while it was cool the first time, I was not particularly excited to have an entire DLC take place in one of these Fallen Ruins. These areas felt like the least inspired out of the base game, and while the Magitech future realistic aesthetic offered a stark contrast to the high fantasy around them, they also felt the least fleshed out. This fear was luckily dashed as soon as I stepped into the tower itself and came across the game's first boss, Sigma. Aesthetically impressive, fun mechanically, Sigma was everything I enjoyed about the Final Fantasy XVI boss formula. And one of my favorite things that Yoshi P and the Final Fantasy XIV team did was blend what they had learned creating that MMO boss experience and bringing those mechanics to the action setting of Final Fantasy XVI. AoEs, no-go zones, projectiles, and more all give you plenty to interact with. This is where Echoes of the Fallen shines, and if I'm being perfectly honest, would be the only reason outside of the story you get to in this DLC for you to actually play and get this DLC. Outside of the boss fights, there is really nothing new to experience here. It's all a lot of more of the same. The Fallen were collecting creatures, giving them the big suck, and then using their magic to artificially create crystals, along with their own synthetic mother crystal. This does create an opportunity for there to be a new combination of monsters mixed with the Fallen Magitech automatons, seeing most of the monsters and Fallen type enemies represented at one point or another. Unfortunately, new basic monster types were not part of the price tag, and after a lengthy base game full of these same enemy types, I was hoping for a bit more fresh content. The game does throw some new equipment at you, but you likely won't find it impactful enough to abandon whatever setup you have become accustomed to. No new true icons also means no new spell sets for you to play around with, so again, while the combat and such is still extremely fun and satisfying, it's nothing we have not done before. And if you're a fan of the base game like I am, this should be enough for you, and you will most likely have a fine time with this DLC. However, if you are lukewarm to the initial game's experience, there will be nothing here outside of the bosses and difficulty to probably change your mind. On the subject of difficulty though, Echoes of the Fallen is a pleasant and welcome difficulty spike. I played through the DLC on New Game plus Final Fantasy difficulty, and while I was underleveled, I can tell that the DLC will be a welcome surprise to people that found the base game too easy, specifically in the 3 unique bosses alongside the 2 reskins. Sigma, as I said, is a phenomenal first boss, to the point that he puts some of the boss encounters past him to shame. Omicron brought the same kind of energy as Odin, but this time with a jetpack. Really neat boss fight, but I wish they would have done more than one phase. To put the boss fight into music terms, the build up is amazing, but we never really got the breakdown for the Omicron boss fight. Even when we got the double Omicron fight, them having less health just made it feel a bit underwhelming. Overall though, great fight, but not quite to the level of Sigma. One of the biggest surprises from this DLC for me was the Angra Mainyu boss fight, considering that it was a reskin. This is the most Final Fantasy XIV MMO-inspired boss that they had put into Final Fantasy XVI. The pacing of the fight is perfect in my opinion, transitioning from moments of aggression, waiting for it to teleport, dodging the mechanics it throws at you, whether that be its replicas shooting lasers, creating orbs, doing a bombing run across the screen, or to my complete amusement doing the Final Fantasy classic move roulette and turning the entire arena into a roulette wheel, sometimes with obstacles in the mix. This roulette attack is the breakdown that I wish Omicron had, and this easily makes Angra the second biggest highlight of the DLC for me, besides the final boss, and the title of this video, Omega. Omega is a tried and true Final Fantasy legend. An interdimensional Magitech weapon, Omega has appeared as a superboss in several titles, from its debut in Final Fantasy V to being a central force in the Final Fantasy XIV storyline through multiple expansions. It was this respect to the character that brings up the title of this video. While I feel this boss fight was spectacular, I feel it did not reach the scale of other major bosses from Final Fantasy XVI, nor did it reach the level that I had come to expect from Yoshi P and the team. Omega, similar to Gilgamesh, is an interdimensional menace that in almost all appearances functions as one of, if not the hardest boss of the game. Whether Omega in Final Fantasy XVI is harder than Ultima is subjective from a gameplay perspective, but lore-wise they nerfed Omega to a ridiculous amount. First off, we only got 3 phases of the fight, which was a bit disappointing considering the whopping 8 total phases among 2 separate fights that the base game gives Ultima. I understand from a story perspective that this taking place before the final encounter with Ultima means that they can't surpass the scale of the Ultima fight, but I feel like both Titan and Bahamut also outclass the scale of this encounter as well. Omega was created by the Fallen to specifically challenge and potentially overthrow Ultima, and unfortunately we just do not see that level of power here. Not necessarily because the threat isn't there, but because the game does a poor job communicating it and giving it the proper power fantasy for the situation. Clive and company treat this threat like every other threat that they faced in the tower, which is not only disrespectful to the final boss of the DLC, but goes against the build-up and the lore itself, and most importantly gives us very little new to actually experience. Even in Phase 2, when we get pulled into the interdimensional rift, there is no escalation of response from Clive, who has turned into Ifrit for a lot less. The same could be said for Joshua and the Phoenix, but at least Joshua has the excuse of being weakened from the Bahamut fight, as well as still actively repressing a piece of Ultima. This all culminates into the final phase, Dimensional Compression, an attack so strong that Joshua says it is compressing all of creation. Mechanically for the fight as given, this is an extremely enjoyable and tense DPS test. Attacks are flying at you, the area is shrinking, and all you have is all-out aggression. I have no issues with this moment from a gameplay perspective, but from a story perspective, I expected more than a, well, we'll just have to kill it quickly moment. Maybe I was the only one that enjoyed the icon fight segments from the base game, but I just find it odd that one of the biggest selling points of Final Fantasy XVI giant kaiju battles was missing from its first DLC, making Omega the only icon in the game to be defeated without the power of Ifrit. I'm sure the Rising Tide DLC is going to double down on the icon battles, or at least I hope it does, but it seems like a missed opportunity to create a Bahamut-level icon spectacle of this boss fight, and combine it with the excellent hack-and-slash gameplay that we get in the final moments of the Ultima fight. The pacing for the fight that I was wanting was something like the initial phase, which I feel was perfect as it was, and made an impressive entrance for Omega, followed up by the Phase 2 Interdimensional Rift change. Then follow up Phase 2 with an escalation event, force Ifrit and the Phoenix out, and give us a 1 or 2 phase icon fight, one potentially with Ifrit and Phoenix separate, and then another with them combined up like they did with the Bahamut fight. This could then force Omega to turn off its safeguards and then finally begin the dimensional compression, removing the ability to stay in icon form from Clive and Joshua and still giving us the tense, frantic, and fun DPS test that we got in the final moments of the fight. All in all, this leaves Echoes of the Fallen in a weird spot with me in regards to Omega and the DLC overall. Although it wouldn't seem like it for how critical I've been in this video, I did thoroughly enjoy Echoes of the Fallen overall, and I would wholeheartedly recommend it to anybody who enjoyed the base game. That being said, I feel like the $10 price tag held back Echoes of the Fallen from being an even more fun than it already was, and specifically held back Omega from being potentially one of, if not the best bosses in the entire game up to this point. DLCs, in my mind, should always seek to elevate themselves past whatever bar the base game had already set. That can come from multiple fronts, be it the story, gameplay, new powers or weapons, and bosses, and in the best case scenario, it's a combination of all of the above. Maybe this is me expecting too much from a $10 DLC, but when I enjoy things, I just want them to be the best that they can possibly be. While the boss fights, and specifically Omega, were a ton of fun, I was always left hoping that there would be a little bit more. Maybe that's just the calling card of a good game, always leaving you wanting, and hopefully Final Fantasy XVI's Rising Tide DLC will scratch that itch when it releases. But until then, if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. We'll be doing a lot more Final Fantasy themed content in the future, so be on the lookout for that. But until next time, Tenna Crew, take care, be safe, and much love. Bye-bye.